Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to another episode of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. I'm your host, Dr. Valerie Nyberg, and this is episode 8. I'm calling it Me, Myself, and I because it's just me. No interview this time, no one to kind of buffer the distance between me and the camera and you. I want you to know me a little bit better, as well as to understand the work that I'm trying to do. So without further ado, let's get started. So this notion of authentic self, I have been watching TV and other things, and this notion keeps coming up, and lots of things that I've been viewing and seeing and being exposed to. The first time last week was when Hoda Kotb and Savannah Guthrie were profiled under the Today Show. Anyone who knows me knows that I watch the Today Show as much as I can. For being inducted into the Broadcaster Hall of Fame. They were inducted at the same time, and they talked about their working relationship and just the environment at the Today Show, and being really able to be their full selves and to show up as their full selves every day, and what a gift that was, and how each other had helped the other to experience that and to feel comfortable in that space. Then I was watching Tamara Hall, which I don't actually watch very often. And she had an episode last week about the role of faith in modern society in today's world. And she had TJJ and his daughter, Sarah Jakes, I think her last name is Roberts. And she talked about how she got pregnant at 13 and had her first child at 14, and how she had really thought that damaged her in a way that she couldn't share that information or share that reality with others. And it was only when she started to open up about that experience that she really felt the call to ministry and felt that she should share that information with other people and her journey, and how being her full self and all of the foibles that comes with, and enabled her to really be a better minister. So that's kind of what we're talking about today on this episode. I'm just using myself as the subject. Of course, I always like to read and find more information. So I Googled authentic self and found an article by psychologist Judith Falk. And basically, she defines it as who you are at the deepest core. It's being true to yourself through your thoughts, words, and actions, and having all of these three match each other. When you aren't in touch with your authentic self, it's easy to go into people-pleasing mode and to do and say things that are based off of what others expect of us, or what social or peer pressures that we're under at the time. I think this is super relevant, especially when we think about and talk about trauma-informed care, and how we as social beings, particularly in this time with social media, are presenting ourselves. We're always presenting ourselves and always trying to craft a better self. She makes a very clear distinction that our authentic self is not our best self. Our best self is edited. She uses the example of going into a job interview. You're not necessarily focusing on your worst mistakes or the things that don't make you an ideal candidate for the job. Instead, you're only presenting those best parts of yourself. She also used the example of Pinterest, or even Facebook, where you're kind of curating those best elements of who you are, and kind of pushing down or pushing to the side those things that are less perfect and less what we would consider shareable. And the reason why I have come to this topic for today is really kind of understanding myself. I meet with a couple of friends regularly throughout the week. And one of my friends had listened to a few episodes of my podcast and said, it mentioned that I was holding a lot back. And I do that. People who have worked with me have told me that I hold a lot tight, a lot of myself tight. And I have really, really tried in the last 5 to 10 years to really reflect upon that because as a building leader, as an educator, that who I am and how I show up does impact the work that I do. When people ask me kind of what I'm up to these days, and I talk about my company Liminal, people don't know what liminal means. Basically, that term liminal came from Victor Turner. He was an anthropologist who studied African tribes in Africa, and he came up with the notion of liminality as that moment in between. He used the notion of a rite of passage when you go into that rite of passage and have that experience, you're not the person you were before the rite of passage, and you haven't formed the person you'll be after the rite of passage. So you're in that space in between. I like to think of it as a threshold because you're right on the cusp of something, but you're not neither here nor there. In my life, I have always felt in between. This is a picture of me when I was 10 years old. That picture was taken by a neighbor in my apartment complex. I don't remember the lady's name. I just remember she was a white lady that lived in the same apartment complex. And I remember it being prompted because I didn't really have a lot of pictures of myself as a child. And she thought that that was something that needed to be fixed or rectified. And so she took this Polaroid picture of me and gave it to me. And when I brought it home to my mother was really upset. My mother felt threatened by the fact that, or I shouldn't say threatened, she responded in a way that led me to feel that she felt threatened. She asked me who the lady was and why would she be friends with a 10-year-old like me? Like what could I possibly bring to her life that was worthy of her, wanting to be friends with me? And she was very, very upset and went down to the lady's apartment and told her not to speak to me anymore because it was inappropriate for me to have a friendship with an adult. And really what I took from that was, ooh, sorry, was this notion of always keeping everyone at bay. I wasn't permitted to have a lot of friends, to have a lot of expression outside of my mother's household. So I learned to bound myself pretty tightly. There's a lot of unpacking there to do that we don't have necessarily time in this episode. But that's kind of how I situate myself. And then, I present myself in my work as being completely together. I take a lot of time to think about my hair, my makeup, my mannerisms, my articulation, my conversation. Even the people who know me well know that I overlap. When I get really excited, I will overlap in conversation. I'll talk right over you. It's not meant to drown out other people. It's my excitement. But in a professional capacity, I really try to dampen those things down. So I'm never fully myself in any, I struggle to be fully myself in any regard, which is kind of what I want to talk about and talk about how that is related to trauma-informed care. In episode 1, I talked about the childhood presuppositions, this notion of the world as a benevolent place, and notion of unconscious innocence really is the absence of the need to be aware or the need to take responsibility for the things that are going on around you. I think it's really interesting because I kind of look at it as like that taken for granted state. I take it for granted that when I go outside, I'll be able to walk to my car, get in my car and drive away. But if I didn't have a car, if I had to get someplace, I would have to go through a lot of other steps in order to figure out how to get from point A to point B. But because I have a car, it's just taken for granted that I can get to where I need to be, and then I can be on time, and that shapes how I prepare myself. Life is meaningful. I shared in episode 1 how through my mother's sense of religion and God and Catholicism, I've always felt that life is meaningful, that we all have a purpose. Each one of us has an individual purpose in this life, and our job per se is to figure out what that purpose is and then to go in that direction. And then the self is worthy. Now, I think this is a really important aspect, because it really speaks to how we think about when things go wrong, how we then think about what that means and who's responsible. Just like if we're not having our needs met, and we don't think the world, like there aren't things that we take for granted, we start to develop these coping mechanisms, that fight or flight or fawn or fold. That is where we go to when we're in those situations. A perfect example of this is last week I was applying to a writing fellowship, because right now I'm trying to take my writing more seriously and develop it more professionally. And I was putting together some pieces of writing. This is a clip from my memoir that I wrote in 2004. The context for this is it's in a chapter where I talk about sitting in a health education class, and that's being taught by this nurse, and being very uncomfortable. She's teaching us about child abuse and the signs of child abuse, because we're, as teachers, we're mandatory reporters, and she's going through like a lot of information. And I found it completely uncomfortable. And in the paragraphs ahead of these 2 paragraphs that I'm highlighting, I talk about looking around and seeing if other people are just uncomfortable as I am, seeing if other people are having the same emotional response as I did, and not finding that. And then finding ways to just kind of dampen down that discomfort, so that I can take the effective notes and do well in the class. But I find it very interesting that those things are said above the paragraphs above the statement, I was not an abused child. My mother cared for me the best way she could, but she couldn't protect me from feeling unwanted. And then I even go on to say I had a happy childhood. We moved from place to place, but that was normal. And as long as I was with my mom, I felt secure. Then there were times that she couldn't care for me and we had to be separated, but I focus on the reunions and how happy they were. Now, at the time, I was about 30 years old when I was writing my memoir, and my mother was still alive. And the first time I started to write about my childhood and my life, in a public sense, was when I was a junior in high school, and my mother was very, very upset, and basically forbade me to ever write about our lives, just like she had always forbade me from talking to other people about our life together. And I ended up writing the essay anyway, and I got a good grade. But I just went behind her back to do it. And so I was always very, very conscious of the fact that she didn't want me to talk about the bad things of my childhood. And she didn't want me to talk about the things that really hurt me. It's funny, this summer I found some paperwork, or not, I shouldn't say paperwork, excuse me. I found the court files that I had pulled when I was working on my memoir in the early 2000s, that I hadn't really gone through. The focus of my memoir at the time was as being molested. So I really wasn't looking for to examine my relationship with my mother, as much as to work out the trauma from being taken advantage of sexually at a really young age. But when I found this paperwork this summer, I was shocked that when I was removed from my mother's care at 4, there were a couple of case notes from the DSHS folks who were running my case at the time, and they noted that my mother was unable or unwilling to discuss how her decision making had a negative impact on me. And at one point, the caseworker said that the way that my mother interacted with her about these things amounted to emotional abuse, because she just wouldn't, she'd either shut down or she became incredibly defensive, which was exactly what I experienced when I wanted to discuss these things and talk about these things as a adolescent and in my early 20s. My mother just could not do that with me. And so even though my whole point of writing a memoir was to kind of exercise those things and to really examine things, I was still consciously holding in many, many things that I just couldn't face at the time, that I'm now trying to face, and be a better person, I guess. Um, and that leads to some uncomfortable truths. The intercultural development continuum is a research-based way of understanding kind of where we are in our intercultural development. And it actually now has 6 stages. I forget what the stage after adaptation is. Part of the work that I've done in school districts is walk people through the IDI, and explain the continuum, and explain how when we're under stress, we can regress to an earlier period or an earlier stage, because those are the coping mechanisms that we understand the best, or those are those coping mechanisms that we go to in that situation, even if when things are going well, we're in a totally different part of the continuum. And for example, we might be in acceptance for the most part, but when we're under stress, we might go to minimalization to respond to that situation. And I bring this up because the first time I took the IDI and got my results, as every qualified administrator has to go through that process, I was shocked and dismayed to find myself as in a minimalization phase, mostly because I've always grown up around a wide variety of people from different backgrounds. Most of my friends are people across the spectrum, and of cultural spectrum. And I've always thought of myself as being fairly open-minded and fairly conversant. But when you dig down into minimalization, one of the core tenets is the notion of going along to get along. And that is always been my primary coping mechanism is, okay, how do I get into this situation? How do I fit in? How do I position myself so that I belong, and I can emulate what I need to emulate in order to not call too much attention to myself, and in order to be able to survive in that space. So I think, like, where we are in our continuum of intercultural development also mirrors where we are with our own development of who we are as people and our own understandings of ourselves. So what does this all have to do with education? I love movies. The Blind Side, one of the notions of Michael, the character, and I'm not talking about the book and that the real person, but the movie adaptation of this story talks about how Michael is absent of it. Well, his coach describes him as looks like Tarzan, plays like Jane. Another description is from the stepfather is he doesn't have a past, he doesn't get upset, he doesn't have a lot of anger. But when you watch the whole movie and you go back to pieces, there's a scene in which Michael is being forcefully removed from his mother, and you have this voiceover of his mother telling him to just forget about the bad stuff. So she had taught him as a coping mechanism when she did things that were not the best things to do, like smoke crack, to turn away and to forget about it. And that was his primary coping mechanism as he had these different experiences. I bring up Joy DeGruy's post-traumatic slave syndrome because I was lucky enough to hear her speak some years ago, not too long after she published this book. And what kind of brought her to that research, she talked about having her son, they had just moved into a neighborhood. Her son was playing out on the lawn of their new house, and she was unpacking and doing things in the house when she heard, I like to say, a kerfuffle. She heard a kerfuffle outside, and when she went outside to investigate what was going on, she saw her son squared up with another Black boy, ready to fight. And when she separated them and got them to kind of calm down and try to figure out what was going on, it came down to, well, he looked at me a certain way. And so she started to ask herself, why do we, Black people, why are we so willing to fight when we feel disrespected by someone's look? Why are we so threatened or taken aback by a look? And so she starts to unpeel the onion of generational trauma that's passed down from one generation to another, of how we handle stressful situations, the beliefs that we have about ourselves as Black people moving about the world, and how we experience, how people have experienced oppression generationally and then pass that along, and that the ways in which that is not supported, the ways in which that is plays out, and how much access we have to the things that we need and the institutions that we belong to, and the things like microaggressions. If I'll give you a case in point. So I'm Catholic, and one of the things I've always been disturbed about Catholics as a child was just how sometimes people can be very uncharitable and very unwelcoming. When my ex-husband and I were very young in our marriage, I would take him to Catholic churches to go to mass because I do enjoy going to mass. My kids can testify to that, and I love the ritual of it and the standardization. It's the same no matter where you are, and the process is comforting to me. And I remember on this one particular occasion, it was Christmas, it was midnight mass. And we were in a church that we'd never been in before. And we got to go get up to receive communion. And this little lady, put her hand across the pew and said, "It's not your turn yet." And she sounded so mad and angry. And at that point, my ex-husband was like, "Okay, we're not going to Catholic church. I don't like the people. They're not welcoming." But those things, those little microaggressions of how people treat you and interact with you have a profound impact when you have a narrative or you have a history that comes along with that's embedded in your family context. And so those things do matter. And that's what she kind of explores in her text, is how those things matter and how then we end up interacting, and why folks can be very, very angry, for not for the reason that's in front of them, but for things that are unseen or not visible in that particular context. And when I think about this, I think about my mother and I used to watch Cheers all the time, and she was a big believer and singing the song, the opening song. And so when you look at the lyrics, it goes, making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away? And then the next, actually the lyrics, there's another stanza in there, but the next one in the song that goes to this the show, sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name, where they're always glad you came. You want to be where you can see your troubles are all the same. Our troubles are all the same. You want to be where everybody knows your name. And as human beings, isn't that what we all really want and crave? We want to be safe. We want to be able to show up and have people who understand what we're going through and can help us manage what we're going through, that we're not alone, and that we can get through this together. One of the things that I think people often don't realize about trauma is something that makes you feel isolated. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are in fact isolated, but because you have that experience and you're not in that experience with other people around you, you feel like you're alone. You feel like you're the only one going through that. And it's isolating to have a traumatic experience, whether they're large traumatic experiences like for me being molested, or small traumatic experiences like microaggressions. Those are real things that have real impacts and stress on us, and lead us to pull away, to pull back, and to keep ourselves hidden and not really able to fully express ourselves. um I'm oops, went the wrong way. um that reminds me of W.E.B. Du Bois, in the Souls of Black Folks. He talks about this notion of double consciousness. Now it's funny because I don't think I've heard any references to double consciousness in the last 10 or 15 years, but definitely as a child and as a young adult, this was a concept that people talked a lot about in terms of understanding how particularly Black people go through life, always kind of having to think about things in a twin sense. My representation of reality, and trying to understand someone else's representation of reality from their eyes. I particularly like the part of the quote that goes, the history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He does not wish to Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He wouldn't bleach his Negro blood in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows the Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. I think that so aptly describes where we are in this moment in history of the United States. Is certainly there are poles, there are ultra left and ultra right who have agendas for what they want or what they're trying to make the country. But I think the vast majority of us just want to be. We just want to be able to show up and be welcome and be worthy and be and be seen. I am I love soundtracks. So John Legend, his song "Let 'Em Shine" was the one of the songs that went with the documentary "Waiting for Superman," which came out what, a decade ago now, which was about charter schools and kind of a lot of, it was about education and some of the good things about education and the bad things about education. But anyway, his refrain is let them shine. Basically let kids come in and be able to build on their strengths and not necessarily always focusing on their weaknesses. I daily wake up and I see things in my Twitter stream. I was caught off guard last week when this response came in. I am just mad that there are currently zero consequences in my school for any behavior. Instead, it's what were you, teacher, doing to cause the behavior? The admin team has a backbone of a jellyfish. As an administrator, I had to balance these competing needs and competing challenges of trying to help adults who grew up in a world where behavior was punished, where we were encouraged as a society to hold things in, to a generation that is being encouraged to not hold things in. In fact, when you have 2 and 3-year-olds who can make some decisions about what their preferences are in entertainment, what they watch on their YouTube, what they access on their tablets, they're being encouraged to really know what they want and who they are at earlier and earlier ages, but yet we want them to come into the school system and be what we want them to be rather than showing up as who they are. I loved the response. So in that Twitter stream, there are a lot of back and forth between people regarding, like, is it a teacher's fault if a student misbehaves? Of course, it's not a teacher's fault, but how we respond, how we show up and how we interact with that is within our control. It is within our ability to address the situation and in a way that leaves us and our students more whole. I love this response. It's not your fault, as in it's not a teacher's fault for the behavior, but when you're sending kids out of the room for doing something harmful, almost makes more sense to send kids to the counselor. There is a reason for the behavior. And a good counselor will find the cause and a solution better than an administrator just suspending or punishing the student. And that is absolutely true. But the reality of our educational system is it's under-resourced. That counselor, in all intents and purposes, doesn't have the time to really help that kid dig into what's causing the behavior and what the appropriate solution is. And the teacher doesn't have the time to do that and teach the full class. So our education needs, particularly at the secondary level, more of the human capital to do this work with our students and sometimes with our adults to find out, why did you respond that way? I'll give a case in point. One morning last year, we got several reports of students running through the hallways after the beginning of the school day and saying F you to teachers. And when the admin team went out to go find these kids, we couldn't find them because they kept running around. Now, this is high school. To have kids running around at high school seems utterly ridiculous, which is kind of like, that's no one's notion of what should be happening. Yeah, absolutely. And then to have kids like repeatedly run away from adults and then split up and be strategic in their approach. By the time I got my hands on one of these kids, and I literally got my hands, I was ticked, especially as the principal. How dare you run away from me? Who do you think you are? All of these things. And when I took that behavior and that approach into sitting down with that kid clammed up. He refused to look at me. He was turned away from me. His answers were one word answers. And I had to get a hold of myself and try to really figure out, why was I so mad? Was I mad because how dare he? Was I mad because he was wasting my time? Was I mad because he was being disruptive and how would that reflect on my leadership? Yes, all of those things were reasons why I was mad. But why was the kid acting that way? What was going on? What was prompting this behavior? So it wasn't until I was able to kind of calm myself down and center myself that I realized that's, trying to push this kid into, confessing his crimes isn't necessarily going to get us where we need to go. So I just said, hey, we're gonna sit here until we figure this out. I've got all day. Looked at my watch. I don't have any meetings until later. So, we're just gonna really, grind this out. And in doing that, I moved over to where the student was sitting. And though the student had hood up, sitting down in a seat, looking at the floor, I positioned myself in front of the student. So if that student looked up, they couldn't possibly not see me. And instead of making him look at me, I just looked at him. And over the series of a half an hour, 45 minutes, we ended up having what was really a wonderful conversation, not only about the behavior, which was, uh, I would call it typical freshman. I don't know exactly what to do or how to do it. I'm just going to be a punk, because that seems fun to me, to get the adults all riled up and to see what they're going to do, and to see what are they going to do to me? Are they going to send me home? Because what kid doesn't want to go back home and go to sleep and watch TV and be with their phone and be able to do whatever they want, and to move through that process. And for me, what I learned from that situation is, if I make the situation about me, I never understand what the situation is for the kid, and I never understand kind of how to approach the situation so that that student will be willing to share themselves with me. So I say all this to say that as teachers, we have much more power, particularly at the secondary level, than we give ourselves credit for. And, we need to form that collective efficacy, which is a group's shared belief in its conjoint capacity or capability to organize and execute the course of action required to procure given levels of attainment, which comes from Bandra, 1997. So when we change our classroom practices, we do so with the notion of understanding and really studying how that influences students, and the outcome for the students. So when you have a behavior in a classroom that isn't what you desire, understanding, like, how can I make it so that that behavior doesn't come up in the first place? Is it, for example, I used to, when I first became an administrator, I used to, in my walkthroughs, I used to kind of count how much time a teacher took between the time the bell rang and they actually started their lessons. 1, 2, 3 minutes. That's a lot of time for kids to kind of get squirrely and start to mess around. And then when you then try to get their attention, of course, that's going to take more time. But if you start your class at the bell with an activity that immediately engages kids, then you can start to, some of that disruptive behavior, you're already start to channel into productive purpose and into the lesson for the day. And while you're taking attendance, you don't have to then wrangle or wrangle the students afterwards, and you're not dealing with those behaviors of, oh, well, he hit me, or she did this, or stop it, and all of these other things that so often derail our lessons. And it's through the ability, collective efficacy leads us to be able to hear about students learning from their perspective, to really understand what they are seeing as their progress, what they are seeing as their struggles, and what's motivating them to keep learning. Because in order to learn, you have to open yourself up, you have to be vulnerable. So understanding how that then comes at a risk, and being able to honor that risk that they're taking with you is super important. And to be situationally aware, to understand like just how the tenor changes when you get to difficult topics. Example is when I once observed a teacher who was teaching To Kill a Mockingbird, and it was interesting to me that the African American students in the classroom were sitting there slumped in their seats, kind of like folded into themselves when she began her lesson. And that told me how uncomfortable they were with the topic, but she didn't even notice. And that's not to say that she's a bad teacher for not noticing, but that situational awareness helps you to be able to read that nonverbal communication that that student is sharing with you, and to understand, okay, how do I make this situation more comfortable? How do I engage the student so they're part of the lesson and part of the experience and not just subject to it? That I went too far. So why high school? I always ask myself this question. I hated high school. High school was torturous to me. I could not, I did not have a good relationship with my mother. I wanted to be emancipated when I was 16. And I didn't have a lot of friends and didn't really know how to navigate high school waters. So it's funny to me that I ended up spending my entire professional career in high school. So why high school? I think it's the best time to see real substantive growth from people. It is, a lot of people think that high schoolers are, once they get to high school, they are who they are, and there's no ability to change that. And I firmly disagree. I think there is so much change and development and growth that happens in those 4 years that it's exciting to see how quickly that individual can change and develop over time. So when I told my mother I want to become a teacher, she told me that I would watched too much Dead Poet Society and Dangerous Minds. And I remember when I was watching these movies in the late 80s and early 90s, how upset I was with Dangerous Minds, because of course it's the kids of color who have these dangerous minds that we don't know what to do with, that we can't figure out, they're it's threatening. I mean, look at how even the presentation of the movie looks in comparison to Dead Poet Society. The tones are harsher, the stance is harder. The kids are they're not even working together. They're just standing kind of as single units, except for the couple that's in the on the right side, versus all being happy, smiling, engaged in a shared activity of Dead Poet Society. And I look at these two images because images matter. They give us a cue as to how we understand and interpret those differences. It's Seize the Day from Dead Poets Society versus Getting Through the Day for Dangerous Minds. Now, think about that. Seize the day. You have the world is your oyster. Be present, take full advantage of it. Remember when I talked about those early childhood presuppositions versus getting through the day, having to just survive, to get through, to just be able to put one foot in front of the other. Those are two very different realities, and our students have those realities and everything in between. And if we don't recognize that, as we're trying to help educate them, then we don't see who they are. I love, although I had mixed feelings about the Freedom Riders, the movie, I love this notion from her text of, helping students to change the world because they can. That's what that's what the next generation's supposed to do. They're supposed to be change agents. So why do we in high school make them wait to figure out the ways that they can change the world? Why don't we help them? Why isn't what we're teaching them helping them to do those things? So I come to the notion of we all wear masks. Part of our coping mechanisms is masking up. For me, I've always thought of putting on my makeup before I go to work is me putting on my mask. Wearing my outfit is me, putting on my armor, and how that positions me as you don't see me, you don't see who I am. Um, and really can isn't the best coping mechanism for how to interact with the world. It really instead um, leads to, as I'm understanding it now, it demonstrates a lack of self trusting of myself and trusting of my ability to be able to navigate with my full authentic self, and really doubting that I'm worthy, that I can, and I should, as a professor, a friend of mine would say, it is the epitome of shoulding on yourself. You should do this, and you should do that, and you should X, Y, Z, and um, really being able to unmask ourselves for ourselves, and to understand where our inner child is in those emotions, like going back to that story of the young man who ran around the school and was telling teachers to f them. I went back to that feeling of just not being able to control the situation, not being able to have a say. That wasn't him, that was me. He didn't make me feel that way. I felt that way. That was the situation. That was my emotional response to the situation. But again, when I stepped back from that, when I was able to see that those were my feelings and not necessarily what he did, but where I went to emotionally and psychologically as a result of what the things that he was doing, then I was able to pull those apart and just respond to what he did. And I love to part of this work is understanding what triggers you and why it triggers you. On the right, you have the inner child stages. Another way of looking at that is the different ego types. Different ego types will help you to understand what your triggers are and kind of your default mechanisms for your responses, and so that you can better understand your own internal monologue or your internal dialogue about the world as you go through it. And I think, like, when we understand those presuppositions, when we understand our own triggers, when we can start to identify other people's triggers and help them work through that, we start to bring together the physical, that sense of safety, being able to show up as yourself, the emotional, that feeling of safety and that love and belonging, and that mental, um, that notion of esteem and strength and self-awareness, and we become, that to me is the spiritual self, because we become an integrated self that isn't just fighting for limited resources, but is really transcending and being the full person that we were called to be. That, going back to that, we all have a purpose. So as I conclude, um, some practical steps for practitioners: center yourself. In order to de-escalate others, you have to be self-regulated yourself. I'm reminded that of, as a person who likes to exercise, that ability to take in the breath, to breathe in and to breathe out and to breathe with our full lungs is cleansing. It's how our body copes with the stress of the strenuous exercise. And when we are cleansing, doing that cleansing breath, we are more present, we are more in the now, and we are able to separate ourselves from that given situation and be present. Again, that ego of knowing that the situation, whatever given the situation, it's not necessarily about you. It's being able to listen to the words and the feelings and the needs that are being expressed by that other. Another situation I was in more recently this school year was when a young lady flipped out on me, and the as she was losing her mind, and I say that in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, but as she was having a meltdown, um, it was the things that she talked about that were most striking to me about being left by her mother, not having anyone that she can depend on, not feeling supported by her family, not having to switch schools and start all over, and all of these things. Like, she was so filled with hurt, that me taking her phone was just another thing that people were taking from her and doing to her. It made sense to me that her response, although inappropriate, was what it was. That doesn't make it appropriate, of course. And we have to deal with those behaviors, but understanding that and being able to listen to those feelings of isolation and loneliness and lack of self-worth and lack of self-love, and needing that reassurance that you can make mistakes and learn from them, it is important. And had I been able to finish that whole process, being able to help her understand that, um, she's in a dark place right now. But what I heard was she needed to be seen, and what she needed is to know how valuable she is, and that, her education is so important, that those suspension and expulsion are definitely things that could happen. Those are not necessarily the best things to happen for her education. And I'm always struck that, as adults, we understand how to get to a little kid's level, how to crouch down and meet their gaze where they are. But as people who deal with young adults, we never do that, or we don't do that. We don't even think to do that, because they should be able to be adult enough. But yet we have our inner child too, and we have our own issues that we're trying to work out. So why not meet them where they are? And I love this book by Herbert Kohl, I Won't Learn From You, because we learning is a vulnerable activity. So until someone kind of not gives you permission, but a sense to that endeavor, because they know that you're safe for them, how do they learn? That's an important process that I think is often so often overlooked and not talked about. I thank you very much for joining this episode 8 of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. I'm your host, Dr. Valerie Nyberg. I hope that you gain some really good insights from this, and please feel free to comment, like, and or share this podcast. And if you're interested in learning more, I can actually break down into really manageable activities, how to center yourself and how to be your best self for your students, and for others. And again, this is Dr. Valerie Nyberg and Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. Thank you very much for spending your time with me. Take care.